Welcome to this special edition of Four Corners. As part of our 50th anniversary celebrations this year, we've chosen 6 outstanding reports from the Four Corners archive to replay on News 24. Tonight's story, which comes from the late, great Paul Lynham, still resonates today, 34 years after he first told it in 1977. It was about the domination by foreign mining companies of Australia's rich mineral deposits, and one in particular, the US resources giant Utah, the first big exploiter of Queensland's Bowen Basin with a huge profit expectation. Utah enjoyed the enthusiastic patronage of the Queensland government of Joh Bjelke-Petersen, whose controversial 19-year reign as Premier was ultimately tarnished by the institutionalised police corruption that had flourished in the Joh era. This was a landmark program for Four Corners and Paul Lynham, with one particularly remarkable moment when the Premier was laid bare by a series of well-researched questions about his denials of a fundamental conflict of interest, his financial interest in a mining operation that was selling coal to a government-owned power company. Here now is Paul Lynham's report.
This train is more than 2 kilometres long. It's pulled by 6 50-tonne locomotives, 3 at the front and 3 in the middle. They're coordinated by a computer. There are 148 coal trucks carrying a total of 8,500 tonnes of coal. That's about $400,000 worth. Each week, more than 70 such trains carry the rich coking coal from Queensland's Bowen Basin down to the coast, to the bulk ore carriers bound for Europe and Japan. And each week, the Utah Development Company of America makes another $3 million clear profit.
Well, the coal company came with the world's largest shovel. They stripped all our timber, they tortured our land. They dug for our coal till the land was forsaken, and put it all down to the progress of man. Now, Daddy, won't you take me back to Moranbah County, down by the Green River where paradise lay? But I'm sorry, my son, but you're too late in asking. Mr. Utah's coal train has towed it away.
Utah first came to Australia as a construction company in the early 50s after the Victorian government advertised worldwide for tenders to build the Eildon Dam, 100 miles northeast of Melbourne. Then followed the St Mary's ammunition factory near Sydney, a $25 million contract, and after that the Tantangra Dam and tunnel in the Snowy Mountains scheme, completed in 1957. Utah seemed to be going well, but then the company began work on the Lake Mundara Dam for Mount Isa Mines. Halfway through the project, Utah was caught by the tropical wet, and Mount Isa Mines called in Thiess Brothers to complete the job. Then Utah built the King's Bridge in Melbourne. When the then Premier, later Sir Henry Bolte, opened the bridge, he described it as something very real and lasting for the community of Melbourne. The next morning, a truck with a heavy load left a section of the bridge crumbling and sagging. A Royal Commission later criticised Utah and the other companies involved for embarking on a project for which they were not fully competent. Utah and the others agreed to pay $250,000 towards repairing the bridge. At that time, Utah construction was known in the trade by the nickname of utter destruction. Today, only 15 years later, Utah is Australia's most profitable company, with gross revenues almost half those of the Queensland state government. The reason for this remarkable turnaround is, of course, coal.
Utah was a pathfinder of coal development in Queensland, and that's one of the things you've got to always give Utah credit for, and particularly those people who want to be critical of them, that they went in, they explored the area, they developed it when coal prices were very low, And they made a success of it while other companies were not making a success of it. And they've made an enormous contribution to the wealth of Queensland and, of course, to Australia's balance of payment situation.
It's a typical case of what's happened in other mineral industries at the same time. And it's followed the expansion of overseas markets, and it's followed the development of the bulk shipping carrier. The same thing exactly happened with respect to the bauxite industry, and the same thing happened with respect to the iron ore industry. It wasn't suddenly people getting up from overseas and getting full of enterprise and ability to undertake risks. That didn't happen. It suddenly became profitable. And when it became profitable, the first in were the people who had greater access to these combinations of huge sums of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, sums beyond the capacity of the Australian Stock Exchange.
But it may have been almost accidental, really, that Utah got it. If they hadn't got it that week, maybe somebody else would have got it the week after, for all we know.
But probably not an Australian company.
Probably not an Australian company.
An Australian company would have found it very difficult to finance. But think of what Utah had. In 1962, it had an exploration permit over a known coal basin of 2,500 square miles. That's a huge sum. That's a massive area of land. And
which they got this permit for nothing.
They got the permit for nothing, and they picked the eyes out of the Bowen Basin. They got the best thing going.
The existence of coal in the Bowen Basin had been known for many years before Utah came along in the early 60s. But because there'd been little demand for coal, the State Mines Department had not conducted any detailed geological survey of the area, and the overall picture was very sketchy. It was this man, geologist Don King, who filled in the details for Utah. With Utah's exploration permits covering 2,400 square miles, King scoured the Bowen Basin for a year. Then he began test drilling. After only one test hole, King knew that he'd found for Utah the gently sloping sides of the Bowen Basin coal seam, rich coking coal that could be extracted by the highly economic technique of open-cut strip mining. Today, Utah operates 4 massive open-cut mines in the Bowen Basin: Blackwater, Saraji, Peak Downs and Goonyella. And the company's profits have risen from a mere $8 million in 1970 to $137 million in 76. That's $137 million after all taxes, royalties and costs have been accounted for. No other company operating in Australia has ever made so much money. Last year, BHP made $63.5 million, less than half of Utah's profit. And while BHP employs more than 60,000 Australian workers, Utah employs 2,700. But what happens to Utah's massive profits? Well, that's a decision for the company's board of directors in San Francisco. Since 1972, Utah has sent more than $290 million back to the United States. In the early 60s, Utah had an international perspective that most Australian businessmen lacked. The company could see that the Japanese steel industry was developing a huge appetite for high-quality coking coal. And even though coal then was only $8 a tonne, the company spent more than $10 million exploring and proving the Queensland reserves. After that, Utah secured long-term contracts from the Japanese, which in turn enabled it to borrow the $400 million to develop the mines. But not even Utah had anticipated the Arab oil price rise. Since then, coal has become a glamour investment, worth about $50 a tonne. Australian investors have a 20% share in the 3 mines in the northern part of the Bowen Basin, Goonyella, Saraji and Peak Downs. And Mitsubishi of Japan owns 12%. That leaves Utah with 68%. Now, although Utah had to borrow heavily to develop the mines, its original personal stake in terms of hard cash was less than $25 million. However, Australian investors over the years have paid the company $170 million for their 20% share. Although that picture's slightly distorted because of inflation, it's clear that the Queensland coal has been a bonanza for Utah in many ways. The company's already paid back most of the money that it had to borrow, while still declaring massive profits. But while the company's critics claim that Utah's ripping off Australia, the company replies that it's being criticised simply because it's successful.
My response to that, Paul, is that our profits are commensurate with the investment which we've expended in the operation.
It's not a bad return, though. You're making about 36%, aren't you?
At this point of time, yes, but in looking at those sort of things, one must have regard to the long term of the operation. And whilst 36% right now seems good, we hope to be running the operation in 200 to 300 years' time, and on that long-term basis, it's dangerous just to look at what's happening at this very point in time.
But even if you were to make half of your present annual profit over the next 200 years, that would be a massive amount of money, wouldn't it?
Well, it might be a lot of money in terms of actual dollars, but commensurate with the investment and what's involved, it isn't that rewarding, Paul.
There's a place for companies like Utah, but the point is they are making the best of a good thing. They're very high in their foreign capital, foreign equity, around 80%. And they're operating huge open-cut mines, which, of course, employ very few people. Now, they're making a positive contribution to Australia, I wouldn't deny that, but it's very much a deal running in their direction. And while we certainly do need a proportion of foreign capital, the control and ownership of Australian resources ought to be the prime requirement of Australian resource development policy.
Can you understand why some people resent Utah making such massive profits simply by digging up Australian coal and selling it to Japan and Europe?
Actually, I find that rather curious, Paul, that there is any resentment, because that to have resentment means that the people who feel that way are not really well informed. They are not having regard to, they're having regard only perhaps to the profits without looking at the other side of the coin.
Well, these are the taxes that you pay.
Well, that's a very good example. Our taxes last year, whilst our profit was $137 million, we paid $201 million in government taxes and other government charges.
That's right, they did. They paid that under the company tax arrangements. But the distinction between a miner and a manufacturer who both pay company tax is that the state gives a miner a block of coal or a block of iron ore to develop. The state doesn't give a manufacturer that. And so therefore, if companies become very profitable because of commodity price fluctuations, which was the case in coking coal, well, therefore they can pay more to the national wealth, make a greater contribution to the nation.
About 2 years ago, Utah decided to respond to this criticism by launching a publicity campaign to improve its public image. The job was given to George Patterson Proprietary Limited of Sydney, Australia's biggest advertising agency. The fact that Pattersons themselves were foreign-controlled was purely coincidental. Latest official figures show that foreign-controlled advertising agencies account for more than half of the industry's total turnover in Australia. For Utah, Pattersons came up with the slogan, "We're backing Australia," and Rod Taylor was flown in from Hollywood to make the television commercials. Because he lives in the United States, Mr. Taylor was paid in American dollars.
Well, it's a long way from Hollywood to Hay Point, but that's where I am right now. South of Mackay, Queensland. The Utah Development Company built Hay Point. Utah is Australia's largest exporter of coal. You know, they tell me over the last decade, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent up here. The important thing for Australia is that every time Utah spends $1, it inspires other industries to spend $4. I've learned there's enough coal up here to last for hundreds of years. So development can continue to grow, and the towns are going to grow larger, and the jobs are going to be increased. Utah is going to spend a lot more money in Australia, as will other industries. Utah believes in backing Australia.
Although the company believes that the commercials have had an impact, Utah's critics remain, even here in the Queensland town of Moranbah, the town that's often cited by the company as evidence of Utah's contribution to Australia. The town's situated near the Goonyella and Peak Downs mines, and it was built from scratch to house the company's married employees.
We employ approximately 80% married men and 20% single.
Why that proportion?
Well, when I started with the company 5 years ago, the proportion was about 60-40. We've gradually increased that proportion up to the current 80-20, largely following requests from the unions to increase the percentage, and also from our own deliberate acts, because we believe it offers more stability and a greater opportunity for breadwinners in a family situation to find employment.
And to attract and to keep this pool of reliable, steady married men, you need towns like Moranbah.
Exactly.
Moranbah is like a new outer city suburb that suddenly dropped into the Queensland bush. With a population of nearly 5,000, there are about 900 homes, 2/3 of them built by Utah and the remainder by the Queensland State Housing Commission. By leasing the Commission homes, Utah controls almost all the housing in the town, and the homes are rented to the company's workers for $5 a week. Company spokesmen point to this cheap rental as an example of Utah's generosity. But to meet the coal contracts on which Utah's massive profits depend, the company must have a stable labour force close to its mines. Despite the construction costs and rent subsidies, it is of course the company that benefits most out of Moranbah.
Well, sure, there are advantages to the company, obviously, but there are advantages to the community and to the nation. It helps in decentralisation, provides...
But if the coal was 10 miles out of Sydney, you'd presumably be there, wouldn't you? Exactly. So the decentralisation's rather an accident?
Well, it's an accident of geological evolution, really. That's...
And presumably the town, the construction work you've done there is tax deductible?
Yes.
Four Corners visited two of the families who live in Moranbah. Here in Belyando Avenue live Bill and Lorraine Coffey and their 3 children. Bill Coffey is president of the local branch of the Miners' Union at the Peak Downs mine.
Justine.
Thank you, Lord, for this food we are about to receive, and make the Lord make us truly thankful.
Amen.
Across town at Arcana Terrace live Jim and Katie Walsh and their 2 young daughters. Jim Walsh is Industrial Relations Advisor at the Goonyella mine. Because Jim Walsh is a member of Utah's senior salaried staff, he has a much bigger house than Bill Coffey. It's all part of the subtle social structure of the town that outsiders take a while to understand.
Well, I think it's typically an American idea, that class distinction. You know, the company seem to go in for that type of thing. There's a Arcana Terrace, that's all the management staff and people on a management and hire. Then you have the people on super...
That's Snob Hill.
Snob Hill, it's referred to, Arcana Terrace. They're all 5-bedroom homes with 2 bathrooms, and that's where all the executive staff, managers and assistant managers and chief engineers and such, industrial advisors, the chief people.
Flying over Moranbah in central Queensland, one of the towns built by the Utah Development Company for their people. Of course, they needed to build the towns for the people who work the coal, but a lot of thought for their happiness went into the planning, believe me.
And what's the next one down on the social ladder?
Well, then you have the high-blocked home or split-level home. And this home is lived in by the foreman, supervisors, and people that are A-class staff. They class them as A-class. They have 2 classes of staff within their own structure, Utah, A-class and B-class.
I think the planning of the town, where you have such a place as Arcana Terrace where the senior staff live, wasn't good planning. But I think in the interpersonal relations between people in the town, in my experience, it doesn't have any significant effect.
What's it like here in the town?
It's quite good living. The social setup of the town is something that's a little hard to appreciate by people living outside of here, I think. But,
what do you mean by that?
Oh, you get your sort of a class discrimination, like, you know, we live in a high block house, and my wife finds it very difficult to live here at times because people in lower block house sort of look to her and say she's somebody from somewhere else. You know?
What sort of things are said? I mean, how does this express itself?
Oh, you'll get people, they ask you all the time what your husband does at work, and so they're automatically thinking, what sort of house do you live in? You're in a high block or a low block house.
Why is it so important?
It's not important to me, but it seems to be important to a lot of the other people that are here, to a lot of the wives.
And what's next down the list?
Well, then it's ourselves, the worker. You know, all the workers that are married that work for Utah are supplied with a 3-bedroom home or barracks accommodation if they're single.
Companies like Utah now get leases to mine coal by assuring the government that they'll undertake expenditure on capital works on mining in the way in which the government would like to see it done. But they make no cash payment or make no agreement to pay royalties over and above the normal rate for that right.
Has this always been the case?
In Queensland, it's been the case that there's never been any specific lump sum payment for right to mine, that's true.
And how does this compare with other states?
Well, in New South Wales, which until recently was the largest coal mining state in Australia, they have a system whereby companies pay a lump sum for the right to explore or make a payment of a super royalty over and above the normal royalty rate, so that the state does get some sort of payment for the intrinsic value of the resource that it owns.
Is this to suggest then that, say, New South Wales gets relatively a much better return than, say, Queensland?
Yes, in relation to the quality of the resources in New South Wales, they get a much better return than Queenslanders get.
The latest official figures show that foreign companies control nearly 59% of the Australian mining industry. In Queensland, foreign control extends to 85%. The Labor Party in Queensland has put out a bumper sticker highlighting this problem, but Premier Bjelke-Petersen says there's no problem at all.
There's plenty of opportunities for every Australian, for you, for anyone who likes to get stuck into any sort of mining that you like. Plenty of opportunity, plenty of coal. You don't need to wait till somebody else comes here, but let's get on the job and get jobs and job opportunities, that's sure.
Well, why is that? Why would Queensland give their coal away so much easier? And what's the incentive for them to do that?
I really can't fathom that out. Whether they feel that the power of the companies is too great in relation to their own power, whether they think that they can keep the voting public happy with such a small return, I don't know. And it's a fairly large return, but small in relation to the return that could be achieved.
Utah doesn't like to discuss the extent of its Queensland coal reserves, but they're known to be more than 6,000 million tonnes. Last year, when Utah made its record profit, it exported a mere 15.5 million tonnes, a tiny speck compared with what's still left in the ground. Most of the reserves are in the North Bowen Basin, where the company's 4 leases cover a total of 175 square miles. Under the terms of its mining lease, Utah pays rent to the Queensland government of $1 per acre per year. And yet I've spoken to several experts who appear to be genuinely puzzled as to why Queensland gives such extraordinarily advantageous conditions to foreign mining companies.
Well, the interesting thing is we are the most rapidly growing state. We've got an office in Sydney, one in Melbourne we're setting up at the moment to cope with the demands, inquiries from business people who want to come to Queensland because of the way it's growing and prospering. There's no special concessions as far as companies are concerned, other than they've got to comply with government requirements. They pay their taxes, they pay their taxes to us in royalties and freight. Yes, we want jobs and we want job opportunities. The more we can get of it, the better.
State government taxes and royalties paid by Utah last year accounted for less than 4% of the company's total revenue, or $21 million, while rail freight to the Queensland government amounted to 10%, $56 million. At the same time, the company's share of that revenue was nearly 25%, or $137 million. This year, Utah expects to make more than $150 million profit.
I think it's economic treason, the way the state governments provide mining rights to our resources for a time period far in excess of the incentive required to get them here. And it's just depressing the standard of living of the whole country and exporting our natural resource wealth to our own detriment. It's self-inflicted wounds, and it's just primitive, ignorant advice from the state government departments.
But why should they do this? After all, it's in their political advantage. To their advantage, surely, to wring as much as they can out of these companies.
I don't believe the people and the government understand private enterprise and what incentives are required and how to attract more investment on far better terms than we are. It's just a matter of ignorance and conditioning of doing what we've always done, which we're taught by our colonial masters in the last century.
Mining is a high-risk operation. First of all, you've got to risk capital in going out and exploring and proving up deposits. Then you've got to take the risk of developing them into a market where there are notorious fluctuations in price.
But their first and foremost consideration is always tonnage. They always want huge tonnage running through those mines. They want to keep them up to capacity. And they do this by selling spot sales as well as long-term contractual sales, but they'll reduce their prices on spot sales markedly to get the tonnage. Now they're selling now to Greece, for instance, at $32.40 a tonne, when their long-term price is $47. They're undercutting their long-term price $15 a tonne. So all the other smaller producers in Australia, who are also accumulating stocks because Japan's not taking 100% of contract tonnages, have to sell at that price as well. And because a lot of them are underground producers with higher costs, it's driving them to the wall. And when the next round of Japanese price negotiations come along, the Japanese will argue that their prices are too high and they ought to be nearer the spot sale prices.
Whatever those figures might be, Paul, the important fact to remember is that all of our coal prices are subject to government approval of every contract. And we just can't sell coal without getting government approval for the contracts. So that's the key factor of this whole thing.
And do these lower prices affect the amount of money that actually returns to the Australian people by way of taxes and so forth?
It does, seriously. Last year I think we exported about 35 million tonnes of coal. If we can't increase the price by $2 a tonne, say, or $2.50 a tonne, the result is you lose $70, $80 million of income for Australia, up to $100 million in 1 year. And that's the result of this kind of sales policy.
Well, what's in it for the government to allow Utah to sell the coal so cheaply?
The government's just negligent in its duty, simply that. It's got the power under the export controls to do it. But Utah, of course, is protected by this government.
To further its good corporate citizen image, the company set up the Utah Foundation in 1975, and since then the foundation has been financed for grants totalling nearly $1.5 million. Most publicity has centred on the foundation's $50,000 grant to the Australian Opera Company, to which the Utah company itself added another $200,000. Utah's critics say that this represents only a few crumbs from Utah's table. However, opera lovers no doubt are grateful, and the company has been far from shy in describing its generosity.
I'm standing on the concert platform of the Sydney Opera House. And if you want to know what this has to do with the Utah Development Company, opera is yet another byproduct of Utah coal. How? It takes money. A lot of money for this kind of transformation. And who better to tell you about it than our own great opera star, Joan Southern.
Thank you, Rod. You're so right. It does take a lot of money to keep opera performing in this country to an international standard all year round. We can only do it with the kind of support that Utah has given us. Utah came to the rescue of the Australian Opera with the most generous support ever offered by private enterprise. On behalf of the Australian opera lovers, the singers, and the staff of the Australian Opera, I would like to thank Utah for backing us.
Utah's strip mining is basically a massive earth-moving operation, and after the overburden has been removed, the coal seam is revealed thick and pure, ready to be broken up by explosives and shoveled into the trucks. At around $48 per tonne, these trucks carry more than $5,500 worth in each load. When Utah began prospecting in the rich northern part of the basin, its lease covered more than 1,300 square miles. However, by law, the company had to give up a portion of that each year so that it would end up with a maximum of 175 square miles. Utah naturally kept those areas where the coal was closest to the surface, where it could be stripped most economically with massive machinery and a small labour force. For coal relatively close to the surface, strip mining is the most efficient. But the Bowen Basin coal seams dip like a saucer, and if future generations of Australians go after the coal in this area, they'll almost certainly have to tunnel underground. A much more expensive and potentially more dangerous operation.
We're not opposed to open-cut mining. It has a place in the mining industry, but what's happening with big multinational coal companies like Utah, they are only mining by the strip method of mining, which is open-cut, and they're taking the upper seams, or all the good seams of coal, and leaving the under seams there, and what they do is backfill the strips, or the holes are backfilled.
Well, what you're saying is that you shouldn't have open cut or strip mining, that underground mining employs more people, so you put a preference on underground mining. What I say is that you've got to try and strike a balance. You don't discriminate against one or the other. They're both important.
You see, they're open cut mining in Queensland, for instance. When they detonate the open cut, all of the underground reserves underneath, there's a risk now that they'll never be underground mined because the roofs cave in from the detonations. These kind of policies these aspects have never been looked at by the present government. We need to be much tougher.
But now Utah is planning its first underground operation in Queensland.
Well, it's starting off in a small way, Paul. It will have an output of about 330,000 tonnes a year.
Compared to your present output of what?
Oh, you've got 4 mines at about 16 to 18 million tonnes a year in total. But it's part of rationalisation of the whole of our operation, and there is a lot of coal which we can only mine by underground methods, and this is the beginning of that overall strategy.
Is there any merit in the suggestion that you're really skimming off the easy coal and that future generations of Australians will find it very difficult and expensive to mine the lower deposits?
No, there's no validity to that at all. I think what I was adverting to a minute ago is that you've got to look at this as an overall strategy, an overall plan to properly and rationally mine the coal in the most effective and best method. And obviously you start in an area where you can justify the immense investment that you have initially so that you can get a return on that investment.
In terms of return on investment, Utah is very successful. So far this year, the company's paid dividends of $130 million, the vast majority of which has gone to the United States. Most multinationals operating here have their local operation incorporated in Australia, and they must pay 15% tax when they send profits home. But Utah's incorporated in Nevada and simply has a branch office in Australia. This has meant that Utah's profits have escaped this tax. However, the government now plans to close this legal loophole with a new law that will apply to income of this financial year. But how can a company pay dividends of $130 million when its earnings for the same period were only $116 million? This was done by paying part of the dividends out of retained earnings and by drawing on cash set aside to cover the depreciation of plant and equipment. The Financial Review commented recently that this indicates that the US group has adopted a policy of taking out of Australia as much money as possible while the going is good. The company replies that the money is simply needed for projects in other parts of the world. Saturday in Moranbah, and Katie Walsh, supervised by her daughters, ices cakes for the school fete. There's an unusually large number of children in Moranbah, and as a result, the average age of the population is well below the national average. Moreover, there are virtually no grandparents in the town and very few relatives. This means that the women have to rely heavily on their husbands for support, particularly with childcare. But with many husbands on shift work at the mines, this is not always easy. And when the women do get a break from the children and the housework, almost the only form of social relaxation available is sport. Moranbah undoubtedly is one of the most sports-minded towns in Australia. Almost everyone, it seems, is a member of at least one sporting team, and many of the social events revolve around sport, like this football club dinner dance. Apart from the sporting competition and the scramble for housing, there's also rivalry between Moranbah and other company towns nearby, and the individual mines too compete against each other. At times it all feels like some sort of vast game devised by an industrial psychologist to keep the workers and their families occupied. Perhaps it's simply the result of isolated communities with not much else to do, except play sport and go to the pub.
It's obvious that Utah are not employing enough Australians. You know, for the amount of overtime that's worked in the industry, we are the lowest paid coal miners in Australia per tonne produced per man employed in comparison to New South Wales mine workers. And it's more than obvious through the amount of overtime that's worked that more men could be employed. At the same time, Utah could afford to give their workers more money, more incentive. The thing is that you've got to work the overtime to make the money here. So, you know, they're not really giving us a lot.
What sort of money are you making on this site?
It depends on the amount of overtime you work, really.
But is it much better than you'd expect to get in, say, Sydney or Melbourne?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I've never been there.
About double what you get in the
About double? What do you do?
Senior foreman in the coal preparation plant, Bowen Yellowmine.
And how much work do you earn?
That'll be giving it away, wouldn't it? I'm on $25,000 a year.
$25,000 a year?
Mm.
Where else could you earn that sort of money in Australia?
I don't know. Robbing banks.
Last year I earned $16,300 for the year. This year I've been averaging so far, since the end of June, around about $500 a week gross.
Well, isn't that a lot of money? I mean, there'd be a lot of people who'd envy you that.
But I work.
Don't get that much.
I don't. That's gross. But I work. Yeah, but I work a lot of hours to get that also. And the union, the trade union movement, have pressed for the hourly rate that I get. Utah give me $23 over award payment a week. That's all I receive off Utah, plus the house for $5, which on the coast could possibly be worth $35.
Utah employs about 2,700 Australians. That's everyone from the office girls to the coal miners. Last year, that worked out at more than $50,000 profit per employee. It may seem a relatively small staff for Australia's most profitable company, but in Utah's minds, it's the machines that do most of the work. In terms of sheer production, Utah is one of the most efficient companies operating in Australia. Jim Walsh, the Industrial Relations Advisor, is visiting one of the company's 15 drag lines. The operator of this massive machine is a union representative, and Jim Walsh wants to discuss some of the men's complaints before there's any disruption to production.
It'd be different if we were a mad radical union that wanted everything all the time, but we're not. We're a pretty quiet union. That's right. You're giving us a hard time as far as we're concerned, so if you want militancy, we can give it to you, and that's for sure.
Well, again, I think the sensible thing to do at this stage is for us to get together and talk about it, and talk about it in detail, get all the facts out.
Yeah.
So you'll be happy.
The dragline's bucket takes 90 tonnes with each bite. It does the work of 20,000 labourers, and all with a crew of only 3 men. And when the dragline wants to change position, it walks, lumbering forward slowly like some sort of science fiction mammoth. With machines like this in operation, you can understand why the mines seem so empty of people, why Utah only has to employ a staff of 2,700.
It takes a lot of people, a lot of jobs to keep these towns running. And that's not just up here. Think of all the other people and other jobs all over Australia needed to keep these people living. They tell me for every one job created by Utah, 3 others are created in other industries. A lot of people benefit from Utah backing Australia.
But one group that Utah does not want to employ is the Seamen's Union. And each morning, the seamen display their placards outside Utah's head office in Brisbane. At present, Utah's fleet of coal vessels fly the Liberian flag and have Spanish crews. The company claims that it could not afford to employ Australian seamen. The seamen, on the other hand, claim that they have a right to work on Utah's ships.
Because they're taking our natural resources out of this country. We want to participate in it. It's our industry. There's no other industry in this country that has to side alongside cheap labour. The only reason the difference between me and another worker in this country is I go to sea. But I'm still under the jurisdiction of the Navigation Act of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia.
We conduct, or we operate 8 bulk carrying vessels on the European coal sales market. We sell a little over 25% of our output to Europe, and the balance goes to Japan. European sales market, the European contracts are written in CNF terms, which means that we sell the coal to the customer, including the cost of transport. Now, for us to operate competitively in that European market, we have to be able to sell at competitive rates. And if we had to have Australian crews on those ships at Australian coastal rates of pay and conditions of employment, we would not be able to compete with the North Americans who sell the majority of coal in Europe.
Well, economists have put it down, it would even lay as much as less than 4% of the 75-76 profit, which was $137 million went out of this country. So it's not a money issue. Money wouldn't matter at all.
Well, Paul, it's certainly not prudent for any business operation to continue in that part of a business which is not economic to do so.
Seamen manning the tugs based in Mackay Harbour have been trying to force the company to negotiate by refusing to berth Utah's ships. The union has also printed thousands of $3 bills which are being given away throughout Australia to publicise the seamen's case. The company has responded by suing the union as a whole and the union leaders individually. And Mr Bjelke-Petersen and Mr Fraser have talked of deregistering the Seamen's Union. It's a dispute that's likely to become even more bitter before it's finally resolved. The late Rex Connor, Minister for Minerals and Energy in the Whitlam government, was one of Utah's most vehement critics. He once said, "I never knew of any company to have so much gall or so little sense of public relations. It is a standing disgrace to Australia." Mr Connor wanted the Whitlam government to impose a super tax on Utah's profits once they'd achieved a reasonable return of about $60 million. As a compromise, the Cabinet agreed to impose a coal export levy of $6 a tonne, which all coal producers would have to pay. This levy was inherited by the Fraser government, and in 1976, for instance, Utah paid $76 million to Canberra under this scheme. But the levy has hurt the smaller, less profitable producers far more than it's hurt Utah, and the Fraser government is phasing out the levy. As there are no plans to introduce any resources tax on Utah's massive coal profits, it adds up to a handsome bonus for the company.
At the moment, we're talking about a secondary tax or resources tax in relation to the Bass Strait oil deposits, where, as a result of government decisions, the two operators there, Esso and BHP, will make greatly increased profits. And we believe that in a case where it's by government direction that they make greater profits, then we've got to look at the question of a secondary tax. Uranium is also an exceptional case, but having mentioned those two areas, I would certainly hope that we never see a resources tax in other areas of our mineral development.
Despite Utah's massive coal reserves, the company was, until last year, limited by a Queensland law which stipulated that Utah could not mine more than 300 million tonnes. At present production rates, this would have taken about 20 years. However, Mr Bjelke-Petersen has amended the law, giving Utah access to another 150 million tonnes. And what did Queensland get in return?
Well, we got a continuity of an assurance that they would continue to employ men and continue to expand, and that they would employ and spend many hundreds of millions more in developing other projects in the area, and that they were then justified in calling on their shareholders overseas and those who participate from here in spending more money.
But do they really need this sort of incentive when they're making well over $130 million a year anyway?
Well, the point about it, of course, is Utah or any other country have got to have a long-term, long-range view. Otherwise, they're not going to expand and develop.
Mr Bjelke-Petersen's enthusiasm for mineral development in Queensland goes far beyond mere political rhetoric. For the Premier himself has a personal interest in the development of the state's coal reserves.
No, I think you shouldn't say a thing like that. I have no coal interests. All my family have no coal interests. I don't know what makes you say you ought to withdraw that. I wouldn't threaten you with a writ, but you shouldn't say it because it's not true.
These official documents from the Brisbane Stock Exchange and the company's office show that a company called Oilmin has tendered to the Queensland government to supply coal to a State Electricity Commission powerhouse to be commissioned in the mid-1980s. The list of shareholders of Oilmin shows that Johannes Bjelke-Petersen holds 21,000 shares. However, the largest single shareholder in Oilmin is another company called Artesian Basin Oil, which owns 1 million shares in Oilmin. This document shows that one of the directors of Artesian Basin Oil is Florence Isabel Bjelke-Petersen, the Premier's wife. Artesian Basin Oil has 24,804 shares on issue. Of these, Johannes Bjelke-Petersen owns 12,154, roughly 49%. This gives the Premier a small but valuable interest in Oilmin, the company that's tendering to supply coal to the Queensland government.
Well, the whole situation in relation to what one might hold or my family might hold is got nothing to do with the whole subject that you may wish to debate. You'd like to revive it again, or some of these things that was much on the news when I became Premier, when attempts were made.
No, sir, I'm not seeking to revive anything, but the fact is that at the moment, Oilmin is tendering to supply coal to your own government.
Well, that's something that I haven't been dealing with. I'm not aware that they have.
Is that a surprise to you?
Well, what have you got? You may have some investment too in something that some way or another indirectly may be associated with something or other indirectly. No, you can talk what you like. All I've ever done is put everything that I can earn and work by contracting in other ways into various investments, just as I'm sure you would if you had a half a chance or had the initiative and go to do it.
But I'm not the state Premier, sir, and this company of which you hold 21,000 shares is tendering to your own government to supply coal.
Yes. Would you like to have a Premier or a Minister or government that had never owned anything, never did anything, never achieved anything? Is that the sort of person you'd like to have?
Well, if it meant that there was a possible conflict of interest,
then
I think I would.
Would you resign?
Well, I'm not suggesting you should resign, sir. I'm just wondering whether there is any potential conflict of interest here in you tendering to yourself.
There is no conflict of interest. You can be quite sure about that. So you can pursue that line as much as you like. But the main point about it is, I think everybody, they like to see people in government or in the head of a business who have demonstrated that they themselves, in their own capacity, have been able to achieve something in their life. And we have certainly sought to be constructive, be productive on the land in various other undertakings. And I hope you're not suggesting that this shouldn't be, and that you should have someone or other that wasn't capable of doing something of this nature.
Indeed, in most Western democracies, with the greatest respect, Mr. Premier, this would be seen surely as improper.
No, you are, of course, trying to imply something. And I would suggest to you that you ought to be very careful, or as I've already suggested to you, that you should be fair, you should be just. The main thing is that I'd like to say to you, the people of Queensland, the people who vote for me in my electorate, in the state generally for my support, they trust me, even if you don't. They know the type of person
I've simply seen the company records, and I'm putting the facts as I understand them to you, sir. Well, you own shares in a company that is tendering back to your own government.
Yes, I've given you the answer. There's no conflict of interest.
You know, I don't know why people call this country the wide brown land, but I do know why they call it the lucky country. The more I learn about what's going on in central Queensland, the more I know why. See, the Utah Development Company's been mining coal in this area for only 10 years. Now they've become Australia's largest exporter of coal.
The Moranbah Cubs prepare to honour the Australian flag, but there are many who believe that in this town the Stars and Stripes would be more appropriate. Can you explain the chain of command of the company? For instance, who do you report to?
I report to the General Manager, Tim Winter.
Who is an American?
He's an American, yes. He's been in Australia for about 10 years.
And who does Mr. Winter report to?
He reports to Mr. Long.
Who's he?
He's a Senior Vice President of the company.
And he's on the board of Utah Development Company?
Yes.
And that board reports to whom?
Well, that board reports to... well, it's part of Utah International Incorporated.
And they have a board?
And they have a board, yes.
And that board in turn reports to whom?
Well, I don't know whether boards report to anybody except that They're part of an organisation. And
but above that, the board of Utah International is the board of General Electric.
General Electric. There was a merger, 12 months ago, between General Electric and Utah International, yes.
Last year, Utah International became a wholly owned subsidiary of General Electric in a deal that valued Utah's Australian assets at about $1,000 million. General Electric's takeover of one of Australia's largest and richest coking coal operations followed months of secret negotiations between Edmund Littlefield, chairman of Utah, and Reginald Jones, chairman of General Electric. So secret were these talks that neither company saw fit to give advance warning even to the Australian government.
If I recall correctly, I know I was annoyed and expressed that too at the time of not being notified in advance that it was happening. The principals concerned said that it was such an important market issue that it had to be kept very quiet, but I didn't appreciate not being informed.
Surely it can't be so sensitive that it's kept quiet from the government of the country in which the coal deposits are found.
Well, I'd agree with you.
It just shows the contempt with which Australia is treated in the US investment circles and the contempt with which the Liberal Country Party government is treated. I don't think they would have taken the former Labor government, taken that advantage, because the consequences could have been more serious for them.
Tell us anything about our economic independence?
No, I don't think, but it does disturb you when these sort of negotiations can take place. In the long run, of course, the government's always got control of the situation. And if we want to exercise our authority, we can. We're the sovereign government, and if we wanted to take action to prevent such moves, we could.
Australia has now become so dependent on foreign capital that about 55% of all company income in Australia is payable overseas.
I'm not going to argue as to what the figures are because I haven't got them available to me. It is available to go overseas. Well, of course, any foreign company here must be allowed to repatriate some of its profits. But I think if you were to look closely at the figures, you'll find a very large proportion of that is reinvested in Australia.
And as long as those profits accumulate in hands of foreigners, it doesn't get recycled through the consumption channels which generate new demand for new investment and economic growth. And I think it's depressing our standard of living in a number of ways. One, we're just not getting as much as we could have in terms of income, but we're exporting our foreign currency. We're depressing our balance of foreign exchanges, balance of payments.
And to the extent that this goes on, presumably have less control over our own economic development?
That's right.
And less control over setting things right in our own country?
Yes, it just gets worse and worse. It's a sort of regressive, regenerative, self-destruct, suicidal instincts, which we're just making the opportunity for economic recovery worse and worse.
Of course, money also means power, and the foreign investors who control more than half of Australian company income obviously have a considerable impact on the Australian economy. This line shows the percentage of private investment in Australia that's been funded by overseas companies. Money flowed in here in 1969-70 because many foreign investors expected a revaluation of the Australian dollar following the mining boom. Much of the money went into property, which helped to spark off the property boom, which in turn helped to fuel inflation. Investment fell away sharply here, partly because in times of international recession, foreign companies usually call their money back to headquarters. But there's another important factor. The dark shaded area shows the years of Liberal and National Country Party coalition. The lighter shading shows the years of the Whitlam government. The government that sought tighter controls over foreign investment, that talked of buying back the farm. As this graph shows, the response of foreign companies was very clear. It was as though they'd pulled the plug, draining off their investment virtually overnight. Without foreign investment, our economic growth and standard of living would fall sharply. But do we have the necessary controls to achieve a proper balance between the interests of foreign companies and the nation as a whole? Are Australians in danger of losing control over their own destiny? Companies like Utah may claim to be backing Australia, but ultimately any company must put its own corporate interests first. There are many experts who believe that unless we realise this and begin some shrewd bargaining, then companies like Utah will continue backing Australia all the way to the bank.
And Daddy, won't you take me back to Moranbah County, down by the Green River where paradise lay? Well, I'm sorry, my son, but you're too late in asking. Mr. Utah's coal train has towed it